Hi, are you familiar with this feeling when you see some famous public intellectual who's respected among some large audience, who's having a doctoral degree, giving lectures in some university, who's written a book, maybe even read a book, on some specific topic which you know little about. But then the intellectual starts talking about the area which you are actually familiar with, and it appears that this intellectual is actually full of shit and spreads the dumbest Russian propaganda there is on the market. Well, meet Jordan Peterson and his essay on the war in Ukraine.
It's called Russia versus Ukraine, or Civil War in the West.
Jordan Peterson has become famous for his opposition to the modern leftist views, destroying his opponents on the topics of patriarchy, gender quotas, and sexual relations between men and women, packing it into a form of deep philosophical and scientific thought. He's also famous for his self-help book called 12 Rules for Life, which contains 12 rules on how to be a decent person, among which there are some good advices like pursue what's meaningful, tell the truth, or at least don't lie, be precise in your speech. Which, if you think about, are rather good advices, especially if the man who's giving them is a confused lying person who's hiding the literal propaganda of a neo-imperialist fascist state behind complex lexical constructions and his own grievances. Jordan Peterson has called his big essay on the war in Ukraine the Civil War in the West, which sounds like an extravagant hot take which no one has yet thought of. And it actually is, because it is a 50-minute long delusional groanings of a man whose knowledge on the topic is based on 20 hours of watching the Russian television. Most probably during the treatment of the aftermath of benzodiazepine addiction, for which Dr. Peterson has chosen Russia, which is apparently his #1 destination for getting healthcare. It nevertheless took JP 4 months to come up with an explanation on why this war is the West's fault and not Putin's, who's actually started it.
When was the last time that a Western leader spent some time face to face with Putin, in the same room, breathing the same air, communicating directly, sharing a meal or an anecdote or a drink?
Touching his hand, slipping into his pants, gently kissing him on his rosy little lips, and whispering into his ear, Vova, you are the strongest man alive.
Has it been several years?
In Jordan Peterson's reality, there were no meetings at the paranoid long table, summits with American president, and painful hours of long diplomatic talks on all levels. Because in a world where Mr. Doctor lives, Ukraine has gas shelf in the Caspian Sea.
It is also the case that Ukraine has immense and relatively recently discovered, circa 2010, petro resources of its own, particularly around the Caspian Sea and in the northeast.
You know how people say that when you talk about some country, you should at least be able to show it on the map? Well, Jordan Peterson did not bother, because this is Caspian Sea, and this is Ukraine. And you ask me how would I know it? Because I'm from Ukraine, and this is where Jordan Peterson has got his knowledge on Ukraine.
Well, Zelensky, the current president and supporter of all things Western, was and is supported by the Ukrainian speakers who live in the Northeast.
Right. And Donald Trump was chosen by the transgender Black Lives Matter activists living on the coast of California. Alright, I didn't want it, but we'll have to get deeper on it. You see, Zelensky is from the south of Ukraine. He had to learn proper Ukrainian during his presidential campaign and got the majority of votes in all but several western and several eastern regions. So why Professor Peterson forgot to Google Ukraine? We might never know. But what we do know for sure is that during his 50-minute stream of nonsense, Jordan Peterson does not condemn the acts of genocide, deportations, mass rape, and other war crimes committed by Russia. What Jordan Peterson does, he's searching for the reason why Russia should feel threatened by Ukrainians.
Putin and the Russians have their reasons for concern over the situation in Ukraine.
And as a historian, Jordan Peterson does not miss the chance to remind us that Europe attacked Russia in 1941.
And as a necessary buffer between the Europe that has invaded Russia to terrible effect in 1812.
And also now is the era of Napoleonic Wars, which also explains why Jordan Peterson did not Google anything at all for this essay. He was too busy fighting the British-Canadian War against the United States. But if you omit all those minor details, what Jordan Peterson is trying to sell is that Russia is a modern stronghold of Western civilization fighting the decadent, degrading West, which makes Professor participate in Pride Month.
There's every sign of a revival of Christianity in Russia, including a veritable storm of church building and cathedral construction. Putin himself is, in principle, a practicing Christian.
And if you suddenly wonder if those are exact talking points of the Russian president and Russian propaganda, they are.
Я считаю, что штрафовать геев за пропаганду гомосексуализма среди подростков мало. Им нужно запретить донорство крови, спермы, а их сердца в случае автомобильной катастрофы зарывать в землю или сжигать как непригодные для продолжения чьей-либо жизни.
Russia is the second in the world by the rate of abortions, first by rate of HIV spreading in Europe, and Putin himself is divorced and having extramarital affairs with only God knows who. Mr. Peterson is not only not condemning Russian imperialism, but he's very much in love with it. He refers to Ukraine as to what are now other countries and calls it a key to Russian identity and security. And says that no one should care about it but Russia.
Remember the Holodomor? Holodomor?
No, but I remember the Holodomor, the artificial famine in 1930s made by Russians which killed several millions of Ukrainians living on the same lands where Russia now commits mass deportations and burns the fields of wheat. So Mr. Peterson knows what he's talking about when he talks of key to Russian identity. This key is conquering the other nations and committing genocides. And Peterson's knowledge of Russian identity comes from the 19th century Russian imperialist, chauvinistic and anti-Semitic author Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky fervently believed in the necessity of a revival of Christianity, and he believed that the Russians would need to play a central role in that revival.
Right. The decadence of the West in 1876. Damn you, neo-Marxist Austro-Hungarian Empire and you gay communist Emperor Franz Joseph I. You will not cancel Jordan Peterson.
That the Russian leader frequently speaks of his country's role as a bulwark against the moral decadence of the West.
Right.
And that he speaks in philosophical and theological terms to a degree unthinkable in a Western leader.
Unthinkable philosophic deepness indeed. But here hides the real meaning of this essay. You see, Putin and the Russian propaganda indeed exploit the notions of the so-called decadent West with their woke culture, stupid human rights and homosexuality. In their propaganda and in Putin's speech they fight for family values as opposed to homosexual West.
Надеюсь, что у нашего общества есть внутренняя моральная защита, продиктованная традиционными конфессиями Российской Федерации.
Well, if Jordan Peterson likes this rhetoric so much, then I have several other options for him. For instance, ISIS, Taliban, and probably North Korea. I really don't know and I don't care. And it makes you think, what does it take for a man with such a status and education to actually believe in this? But not in that this is a kleptocratic authoritarian regime which fights for the West not because of Western decadence, but because it is how they protect their right to oppress their citizens and commit war crimes all over the world. But hey, at least Jordan Peterson here is honest and self-aware. Because at the end, what he asks for is not for Russia to change, but for the West to change according to the Russian understanding of good and bad.
If our G7 leaders had one iota of sense, in my opinion, they would be doing nothing right now but dispensing with the too convenient identification of Putin with Hitler or Stalin and focusing with single-minded intensity on determining exactly what the Russians would accept as a minimum precondition for peace.
And if you think he wouldn't be so dumb to repeat the Russian propaganda word by word, well...
Have we been paying attention to what Putin's men have been saying about the UK? To take a single example?
No.
That a single Sarmat missile would be sufficient to destroy Britain once and for all.
Right. As at the end, Jordan Peterson gave up the last attempts to Google something and just repeated what the Russian TV hosts are saying on their warmongering TV.
And it's not as though the economic sanctions have been working or have been without major collateral damage on a scale yet to be seen. The ruble is doing just fine, and oil prices are not finished escalating.
That sanctions do not work, and Russians are the strongest people in the world. And literally every bullshit you could possibly read in Russian paper. Up until the old tale about the Putin's childhood where he's associating himself with a hunted rat in a corner. And while I was not sure about what conclusions to draw from all this, Dr. Peterson did this job for me.
And are we degenerate in a profoundly threatening manner? I think the answer to that may well be yes.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. And thank you. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment.